So, good afternoon, everyone. At least it's afternoon in the UK.
Okay.
But I believe many of you are from different parts of the world. So thank you for inviting me to give this keynote. So I'm an associate professor in transport and energy interaction at the University of Leeds. I'm also part of what's known as the Center for Integrated Energy Research. And I sit in two departments within Leeds. One is the Institute for Transport Studies, but also in the School of Chemical and Process Engineering, I guess. Yes, yeah. So what I have decided today to speak about is can EVs, electric vehicles, deliver sustainable mobility in low-income countries? So my research primarily is, as I said, on transportation and energy interactions. So I look into vehicle electrification, compressed natural gas conversion of vehicles. I've done some work on that in Bangladesh. But increasingly, since I've moved to the UK, a lot of my work is on more advanced topics such as autonomous vehicles, their implications on travel, demand, carbon emissions from autonomous vehicles, or even sometimes new mobility services and their implications. So what I wanted to focus on today is not necessarily on research. So it's about more about my experience on working in electric vehicles or compressed natural gas vehicles or decarbonizing transport as a whole. And it's more about a perspective. So there's no research paper behind what I'm going to talk about today. It's more about my views about electric vehicles and whether they can deliver sustainable mobility in low-income countries. So it's perspective, right? And when it's a perspective, there can be quite a bit of controversy. Some of you may agree with me, some of you may not agree with me, and that is fine. The important point is to share the perspective and for you to take those perspectives on, especially those of you who are in low-income countries. We are actually trying to write up this piece as a comment piece in one of the academic journals. Let's see how it goes. And Dr. Shams Tanveer from California State University is helping me with that. So let's begin. We all know that electric vehicles have become really popular in the past few. Why my slides are not transitioning? Let's see. Yeah, it is transitioning now, right?
Yes, it is. Please go ahead.
Okay. Just making sure. Yeah.
Yes.
So there has been a dash for electric vehicles in the sense that
Absolutely.
Sorry?
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. Okay. So we all know about the greenhouse gas emission problem and the climate change issues. We know that transportation is a large share of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's also one of the hardest sector to decarbonize. If you look at UK especially, you'd see all the other sectors, residential energy use, emissions from residential energy use, industrial energy use, and the lights have gone down. But transportation is the one which has started going down very recently. But generally, transportation was actually going up even until the COVID. So transportation is a hard to decarbonize sector in general for various reasons. But electrification has become a major pathway to decarbonize transportation, especially in the developed countries here. And one of the reasons is obviously these are very car-centric society, which means it's very difficult to stop people from using their cars. So we have to decarbonize cars, and EVs at the moment seems like the best way forward. And there has been a huge dash for electrification as such. And the picture on the left I have here is the market share of electric vehicle sales in new vehicles in various countries. Sorry, I don't have the name of the countries here, but the one here is Norway, which actually it says it's less than 90, but actually in 2023 it has gone up to 93%. So 93% of all new cars in Norway are electric now. UK is much lower, probably somewhere around 20% range. But in general, in European Union, in the UK, in the USA, the market share of electric vehicle is growing. In China also, it's growing massively. So there's a huge dash for these electric vehicles in general. And there is also, especially in developing countries, there's quite a bit of international aid flowing towards decarbonizing the fleet, and a lot of that is around vehicle electrification. Okay, Asian Development Banks, World Bank, African Development Bank, they often invest on decarbonization, and electrification is seen as one of the ways to decarbonize the transport sector in that part of the world as well. There are issues in terms of electric vehicles and sustainability sometimes. For example, obviously, battery has been discussed a lot in energy literature, that the manufacturing of battery uses a lot of energy itself and can emit carbon significantly. But also there are social issues around that, around mining of those rare earth materials in different parts of the world. There have also been a few studies in terms of other benefits of electric vehicles, for example, reduction in air pollution and the likes. But many of them are in the context of probably individual sectors. There's one study you will see which looks into air quality, another study looks into probably mining, another study would look into greenhouse gas emissions considerations and the likes. What I want to do today is look at it from a slightly different perspective. And also in between, what is not present in the picture here is in a lot of developing economies, for example, Bangladesh and some other places, you see the electrification do not take place only in terms of four-wheeled vehicles. We have a lot of three-wheeled vehicles, three-wheelers that we call, they are sometimes getting electrified as well. So the perspective can be quite different in developing or low-income countries. So what I wanted to look at today is try to find what are the sustainable mobility goals. So we are not really interested about sustainability of EVs per se, but we are looking into what are the sustainable mobility goals in general. So that's a sustainable transport perspective. And try to see how electric vehicles address them. Okay, whether electrification of vehicles help achieve those sustainable mobility goals or not. And it is really important to understand this wider perspective, because if you let me just share a bit of an anecdotal story in this part of the world. In European Union and UK as well, there was a lot of focus on dieselization of vehicle fleet. Okay, and that came primarily again from a greenhouse gas emission perspective, that diesel vehicles are slightly better in terms of greenhouse gas emissions compared to petrol vehicles. And there was a large push for diesel vehicles in this part of the world. But in that push, the policymakers kind of either forgot or ignored the health implications of diesel vehicles are actually significantly worse compared to petrol vehicles. And there were some other issues with Volkswagen that you may have heard. But the bottom line is that in trying to focus more on only one objective, which was decarbonizing the transport sector, the policymakers or stakeholders may have forgotten about another very crucial side of transportation sector, which is the air quality impact and its impact on the public health. So what we do not want to do is we want to solve one problem, but create another problem in another area, right? And that's why I'm interested here on the overall sustainable mobility objectives or sustainable mobility goals. And in order to do that, what we did in this, what I'm going to present in this presentation is I've chosen a few sustainable mobility goals, and there are various frameworks in terms of goals for sustainable mobility. You may already know about the 4 broad goals, and if you include some sub goals, I think it's six goals roughly from the Sustainable Urban Mobility Project of the World Bank. Then there's Todd Littman in the US, or is it Canada? He has like 17 indicators for sustainable mobility. You can choose any of them. The one we have chosen are 7 goals for sustainable mobility. It was developed a bit, maybe a slightly old, in 2004, and it was kind of the business leaders of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. They have developed these 7 goals for sustainable mobility back in 2004. And these are reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce criteria and pollutants, reduce deaths and injuries, or improve safety of road transport, reduce noise from road transport, reduce congestion, narrow mobility divide or improve equity, and improve the mobility options. Okay. So what I will try to do is I will pick up each of these items and I will just share my views in terms of what I feel how electrification may or may not help these factors. Was there a question somewhere? I thought I saw something on the chat window. If there's any question, please feel free to interfere and ask me, especially if it's a clarification question. So
yeah, okay. There's a Q&A session after your presentation, so just go ahead. We are noting down the questions here.
All right, thanks, Chairabuli. Is it Chairabuli or Victress? Yeah. So
Yes.
the number one is all of this has started with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, of course. And we all probably know that at the tailpipe, electric vehicles do not emit any carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions. But that is not the correct way of calculating things. Okay, we must consider what we call upstream emissions. Where the electricity is coming from is very important. All right. So that's number one. And number two is, so that is the average emissions that are coming from the grid, because in order to produce electricity, you need to use coal or natural gas or wind or solar, some other sources of primary energy, and all of these will have very different greenhouse gas or carbon implications, right? So it's really important to recognize that just because tailpipe emissions is 0 doesn't mean electric vehicles do not produce any greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm just talking about running emissions here. Obviously, there are issues with manufacturing greenhouse gas emissions too, and it's now well documented that the manufacturing of batteries and the likes will produce greenhouse gas emissions as well. But still, it's the use phase, which is where most of the greenhouse gas emissions take place, especially in petrol and diesel vehicles. In electric vehicles, use phase will be slightly lower compared to manufacturing phase, but still use phase is still pretty big, unless your upstream energy source is coming from wind or solar, which is green electricity. So even when we are talking about upstream emissions, we also need to keep in mind what we call marginal emissions. So let's say your grid is fairly clean. An example would be, for example, Bangladesh, where a lot of the electricity actually comes from natural gas, which is still obviously a fossil fuel, but one of the cleanest fossil fuels compared to coal, compared to diesel and the likes. Natural gas is cleaner, obviously not as clean as renewable energy sources. However, if we imagine that a lot of these vehicle, or a lot of the vehicle fleet in Bangladesh is being converted to electricity, then we would need additional electricity production in the country, right? And where that additional electricity is coming from. And if you look at the future plans of Bangladesh, you'd see that until 2040, a lot of the additional electricity are forecast to come from coal. So although the current grid is more natural gas focused, the marginal emissions that will come because of electrification it will come from coal. And that would mean that marginal emissions might even be higher compared to the current grid emission intensity. And we need to keep that in mind as well, where the additional electricity for electrification is coming from. This is a slide, just a simple example of the carbon dioxide emission by different sectors. I'll come to that a bit later. So on the right-hand side, you can see the current grid emissions in 3 countries. One is UK, one is India, and one is Bangladesh. In the UK, the grid is fairly clean, 208 grams per kilowatt hour. A lot of UK's electricity now comes from wind. Bangladesh is reasonably still quite high, but it's 586, which is at least a bit better compared to India, where most of the electricity comes from coal. So that tells you that the same electric car, if it runs in the UK versus it runs in India versus it runs in Bangladesh, there will be very different type of carbon emissions because the grid emissions are very different. So we need to keep that in mind. The second thing I wanted to just briefly touch on is on the role of even transportation. Do we need to focus on electrifying or decarbonizing transport right now, or should we wait a bit? If you look at the UK, around 32% emissions are carbon dioxide emissions. These are not GHG, carbon dioxide only, are coming from the transport sector. Whereas if you look at India or Bangladesh, you'd see that the transport sector emissions are substantially lower, okay? Roughly around a tenth. I think I've looked at South Africa, that is also around 12%, I believe. So a lot of these, in a lot of low-income countries, you'd see that transportation is still not a major source of emissions. That doesn't mean we should not worry about it. Vehicle ownership is growing in low-income countries, but it is something for the policymakers to think about a bit, whether we should focus on decarbonizing transport right now, or maybe right now the focus should still be providing cheap and accessible transportation services to a lot of the population who do not have access to those type of good transport services. So it's just a thing that to keep, that is for the policymakers in this part of the world to keep an eye on, okay, instead of just going gung-ho about vehicle electrification. So yes, if we electrify vehicle fleet, in low-income countries. It will reduce emissions. Even if you look at India's very high carbon-intensive grid, even in India, you will see on a life cycle basis, electric vehicles are a bit better compared to petrol or diesel vehicles. So EVs will reduce GHG emissions, but we need to keep in mind what the priority should be, or whether we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions in other sectors first, okay? Because sometimes it might be cheaper to reduce emissions in other sectors than in transport sector. So keep that in mind always. The second goal is reduce emissions and improve public health. So here we are talking about local air pollution, okay? Which are the particulate matter, NOx, carbon monoxide, and the like. Now, EVs do have significant benefits. As I've mentioned earlier, that EVs do not have any what we call tailpipe emissions, which means you do not see these noxious, noxious emissions coming from electric vehicles at all. So although you might see slightly more tire emissions coming from electric vehicles because they are heavier vehicles, so there's more friction between tire and the roadway, and there might be few more particles. But in general, we have seen studies in developed world at least that the emissions of local air pollutants are substantially reduced via electric vehicles. And that is positive in that sense that you can reduce emissions. And if you ask me, to me, actually, that is one of the more solid or one of the more stronger reasons for vehicle electrification, because we know that the air quality, the vehicles in that part of the world are often quite polluting. You'd see, it's not uncommon to see these type of pictures in developing and low-income economies. And that would mean, what's happening? And that would mean that emissions will be reduced significantly if we switch vehicles to electric vehicles. However, here is also something I just wanted to briefly touch on is, yes, electrification will reduce emissions from vehicles, but two things here. One is, what is the source of urban air pollution in low-income countries? And increasingly, the vehicles are becoming cleaner, even if they are not electrified. And the reason is only a few countries produce vehicles in the world, right? Or relatively few countries produce vehicles. And in most of those countries, already vehicles are subjected to very strong or relatively strong emission standards. And the vehicles that we get in low-income countries, we get those vehicles, maybe 5-year-old vehicles. In Bangladesh, for example, you cannot import a vehicle older than 5 years, which means, yes, we are lagging in developing economics compared to developed countries, but still our vehicle fleet is getting cleaner, maybe lagging by 5 years compared to the developed countries or vehicle manufacturing countries. And that would mean that the other sources of emissions might be bigger, okay? So keep that in mind. And also, we have also seen that a lot of the emissions that happen in developing country megacities from vehicles, they do not come from a lot of vehicles. They come from few, what we call super emitters. Okay, there are a few vehicles like this, the ones I've shown pictures of, which emit a lot more compared to a regular vehicle or an average vehicle. So maybe it might be even cheaper to address those vehicles. Now, that could be done by regulation, Or if we have to electrify, maybe focus on electrifying these highly polluting vehicles first to ensure that emissions are reduced substantially more and public health is improved substantially more, instead of trying to electrify all the private cars, which are probably reasonably in reasonably cleaner condition. So keep that in mind for this element. The third one is, why isn't it moving? Yeah, reduce transport deaths and injuries. That is a big goal. Globally, 1.2 million people get killed because of road accidents, and around 20 to 50 million get injured. And in low-income countries, especially, 80% of these deaths and injuries are to what we call vulnerable road users. So not for the car users or motorized vehicle users, but for the pedestrians, cyclists, and the likes. Okay, so that is a major goal. And personally, I do not see why an electric vehicle would be safer than an electric private car would be safer than a regular private car, and how it would reduce road traffic deaths and injuries because of crashes. There are other factors that affect traffic crashes, and that's what we need to focus on. So I do not think that electric vehicles would reduce transport deaths and injuries immediately. On the contrary, almost, I can think about at least three reasons why electric vehicles may actually aggravate some of these deaths and injuries. So these are the two pictures that you see of Volkswagen, two cars belonging to Volkswagen Group. One is a Volkswagen Golf, which is a very popular car in the UK, probably top 5 highest selling cars in the UK. And that's a diesel car, I think, right now. And the one on the right is the Volkswagen's ID3, which is kind of Golf-sized electric vehicle coming from the same stable, coming from the same Volkswagen Group. And what you can see is that the electric vehicles, because of its batteries, are almost half a ton heavier compared to the petrol vehicle. And that has very significant implications for a number of reasons. Number one is braking distances might be slightly longer. Number two, in the case of a crash, the occupants of the ID3 or the electric vehicles will likely be safer because they are in a heavier car. But the occupants in the lighter car, and especially, remember I said, vulnerable users get affected disproportionately highly in developing economies. For a vulnerable user, imagine a pedestrian, the Golf is hitting you as 30 miles per hour versus the ID3 is hitting you at 30 miles per hour. Almost certainly the injuries will be more severe for the ID3. So the heavier vehicle weight will aggravate the injury severity, especially during the transition phase. We do not expect all the petrol vehicles to become electric vehicles overnight, right? So there will be a transition period, and during those transition period, EVs may not be safer for vehicle-to-vehicle collisions, but they will never be as safe as a petrol vehicle for vehicle-to-vulnerable road user, simply because of their higher weight. And also they have quicker acceleration, so during transition phase, there might be some issues there as well. So there are question marks in terms of safety there. The two other things I wanted to touch on is, this is an example of electrification happening in Bangladesh right now. So these are rickshaws. So they used to be pedal rickshaws, and I hope you can see my arrow or the red dot here. See, this guy is actually not pedaling. Okay, he's just putting his feet here. And the reason is this used to be a pedal rickshaw, but if you see here, there are some batteries here, and there's a close-up here. So you see this type of informal, indigenous, unregulated electrification happening in that part of the world. And these vehicles often use your original bicycle brakes, but they can run a lot quicker compared to a human-powered vehicle, which means they are significantly unsafe, not only for the pedestrian, but also for the passengers, because obviously there are no seat belts or anything. If it gets stuck, then the passengers, get thrown away at a higher speed, and that is dangerous, right? And similarly, so these are extremely indigenous, just adding a few batteries and motor and connecting to your pedal. So there's huge safety concerns of these in Bangladesh right now. But also we see this type of electrification, the kind of motorized three-wheel vehicles, which used to be petrol engine before, they have become more like electrified. They are called easy bikes in Bangladesh. In India, they are called totos. Often, again, they are unregulated, so they are not produced by a well-known vehicle manufacturer like Volkswagen or Toyota and the likes. Often the parts come from China, especially when we are doing it in Bangladesh, and local assemblers just assemble the parts and produce things like this, which are very unusual, almost certainly safety hazards. You can see they are not very stable either. So there are issues regarding safety for this type of vehicles as well. And in Bangladesh, the electric revolution has been occurring along these vehicles. You'd see around 1 to 4 million of these vehicles in Bangladesh right now. Okay, and there are no regulatory oversight. The authorities are trying, but still it hasn't occurred. So, and you see this in India as well. I haven't been in African countries recently, so I don't know if they are common there or not. But that's another huge safety hazard for electrification in that part of the world. Reduced transport noise is the fourth item. Electric vehicles itself are less noisy compared to petrol vehicles, as you can see from here. These are the EV average in the now. So they are less noisy. However, we need to keep in mind that in urban areas, engine noise tend to govern, but in motorways, it's tire noise which starts to govern. So keep that in mind as well. But more importantly, from my experience of being in quite a few megacities in developing countries like Bangkok, obviously Dhaka, quite a few Indian cities, 1 or 2 African cities. A lot of the urban noise do not come simply from vehicles plying. A lot of the urban noise comes from using horns or honking indiscriminately. Okay, we use honks a lot in those parts of the world, but also a lot of construction work is going on. You would see unregulated miking, people speaking on mic, loud noise coming from here and there. So while individually electric vehicles are, yes, less noisy compared to a similar petrol car, the overall goal of reducing transport noise by electrification, I am not sure how reduced they will be. In one area, the noise reduction will be substantial, I believe, and that is motorcycles. Okay, motorcycles are substantially noisier compared to a car, and we know that there are a lot of motorcycles in low-income countries. And maybe electrifying motorcycles might actually be beneficial in terms of reducing noise. Sorry?
Sorry about that, Zia.
Please.
Could you explain?
And not to forget that motorcycles, the emissions are quite high as well. And because of their volume, emissions from motorcycles might be very high. So electrifying motorcycles will reduce both your noise and your emissions at the same local air pollution. So targeting motorcycles might be a good idea when we are trying to reduce emissions as well as noise. Item 5 is reduce congestion, and electric vehicles are basically replacement of your current vehicle. So I do not see how replacing one petrol car by one electric car is going to improve your congestion. So that's almost a no-no. There's a huge question mark there. I don't think electrification will help in that area. Narrow mobility divide or improve equity. So looking at the picture on your left, that's a picture of buses in Bangladesh. If you replace that bus by an electric bus, I don't think that is going to help these, say, for example, women at all. They will still have to fight. So it doesn't really improve equity in that sense, right? If you still riding a crowded bus, whether it's an electric bus and a petrol bus, doesn't really change things, okay? So I'm not quite sure how mobility divide between the wealthy and the poor, or between the men and women will be reduced simply by electrification. There can be other things done, but electrification alone is not going to solve this. Almost the same around this picture here. You can see there are the footpath is all taken up by hawkers. So pedestrians are walking on the road. And if these vehicles are electric, it doesn't really affect the safety of these pedestrians, or it doesn't really improve the mobility divide at all, simply by electrification. We need a broader or wider transition. So again, there's a bit of question mark there. And the last bit is improving mobility options. In the original goal, it was more about vehicle ownership, but I wouldn't get into that. The way I have defined it is whether there are more mobility options, and electrification, at least in Bangladesh, has provided, at least improved the mobility options. The picture on the left that you see are basically one-stroke shallow engines, which are used for irrigation, and they were locally used to convert to a kind of a three-wheeler transport vehicle. Extremely unsafe, and we do not see these anymore in Bangladesh. They have been almost completely replaced by these easy bikes. Now, remember I said that easy bikes are still not safe compared to some of the regulated vehicles, but they are at least safer than these completely locally made one-stroke engine, shallow engine driven vehicles. So in that sense, maybe they have improved mobility options a bit, at least in Bangladesh. Okay, so maybe slight positives there. Just to summarize, I think I need to give you some time to ask questions. I tried to summarize our ideas along whether to focus on cars, buses, three-wheelers, and motorcycles. And for example, for three-wheelers, other than safety, it looks like there are quite a bit of positive views here. Motorcycle has quite a bit of positive here as well. But there are still questions around cars, also around quite a bit around some buses as well. so what do we do going forward? There's no alternatives to improving public transport, active travel, and the likes if our goal is to achieve sustainable mobility. Okay, if we want to achieve those 7 goals of sustainable mobility, that's the way forward. Does that mean we will not do electrification at all? No, I know electrification is happening. There are pressure from aid agencies and the likes. There are funding available, so we need to make use of those funds, but we need to prioritize according to our needs. And what can we do? So we must make sure that safety of electric three-wheelers, both power rickshaws and easy bikes, we need to bring them under regulatory oversight of electric vehicle manufacturing, inspection, assembly, and the likes, just like you have them for private cars, for buses. I'm sure all of you have some sort of fitness testing and those type of processes like emitting in the UK. They should be brought in for those three-wheeler vehicle manufacturers and vehicle use as well. A key important thing is researching into the impacts of different types of EVs. So almost doing something like this for different type of, this is kind of an experience-derived one. This is not a scientific piece of work, okay? But trying to get numbers behind these, and then you can prioritize which type of vehicles to electrify first. As I said, in my mind, it seems motorcycles and three-wheelers are better. But if you do not have that information, prioritize diesel buses. Their local air pollution is very high. Prioritize minibuses, maybe small trucks, motorcycles, before getting into cars. All right? There are a lot of cars. There are fewer diesel buses. There are fewer minibuses. So the benefits you will get will probably be significantly higher if we prioritize these type of vehicles first. But ideal solution is to do the research yourself for your own country and then prioritize. Beware of unintended effects. If we talk about, we are already seeing some issues with those battery electric vehicles in Bangladesh. Those are lead acid batteries, and it has led to lead pollution in some places where those battery wastes are getting disposed of. We need to keep in mind of that. And also, it's important to research on the optimum timing of vehicle electrification. Remember the grid intensity we have talked about? Probably electrifying now is not a good idea if your vehicle grid is very carbon intensive, or the marginal emissions that will come from coal. So maybe wait until the grid becomes slightly better. But of course, there might be some air pollution benefits. We need to keep that in mind as well. But the bottom line is we need to do some actual benefit cost analysis and then decide when to do it, which type of vehicles to do it. And that's where I think I will end.